It was just after 10 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday in August 2005 at Rowan County Courthouse in Kingston, Tennessee. Prison guards led a shackled inmate down the steps after a routine court hearing. Suddenly, a woman's voice shouts out, cutting through the summer air. Gunshots erupt in rapid succession. One guard crumples to the ground, mortally wounded, while the other draws his weapon, bullets flying in both directions. Bystanders scream and dive for cover as the prisoner breaks free and leaps into a waiting SUV. In a flash, the vehicle screeches away from the courthouse. It was a daring daylight escape, what authorities would later describe as a Bonnie and Clyde-style shootout unfolding in front of stunned witnesses. An alarm spread through law enforcement. A dangerous felon was on the loose, and he had help from the last person anyone expected. A former nurse who worked at the same prison where the escaped inmate was held. The escaped inmate at the center of the story is 34-year-old George Hyatte, a career criminal 2 years into his 35-year sentence for robbery and assault. By all accounts, George is charismatic but dangerous. A man who can charm with polite yes sir and no sir, even as he's plotting his next move. This wasn't the first time he had tried to break free, either. George grew up in chaos. His parents split when he was young, and he bounced among relatives in foster care. By age 9, he had his first run-in with the law for truancy and fighting at school. As a teenager, he fell into drinking and drugs and dropped out, drifting into crime. By his early 20s, he'd been arrested for burglary, theft, and armed robbery, and even charged with assaulting a police officer. A 1993 court report labeled him a repeat offender with a tendency towards violence. In short, George was trouble from early on. George had one notable quirk. He simply couldn't just serve his time. As soon as he was behind bars, all his thoughts were directed at one thing: escape. Over the years, he pulled off multiple jailbreaks and attempts. In 2002, he and another inmate made a knife out of toothbrushes and a razor blade and used it to threaten jail guards into handing over keys. The duo locked 8 guards in a cell and even beat one unconscious before fleeing. They led authorities on a days-long chase across state lines until they were finally caught in Florida. On another occasion, George escaped from a police cruiser with the help of a girlfriend on the outside, hiding under a pile of laundry until officers found him. Yes, as you may have guessed, in addition to his knack for escaping, George could charm women even from behind bars. By 2005, George had landed in a maximum security prison in Tennessee, yet he hadn't given up on the dream of freedom, and now he had a new source of hope: a woman named Jennifer. Jennifer Lynn Forsyth was 31 years old and had never been in trouble with the law. She was a licensed practical nurse from Utah, an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, until she met George. In early 2004, Jennifer took on a job with a company providing medical care in Tennessee prisons, which brought her to Northwest Correctional Complex. There, in the prison infirmary, her path crossed with inmate George Hyatte. Perhaps it was during a routine checkup or delivering medication that they first spoke. George, with his smooth manners and seeming vulnerability, drew Jennifer in almost immediately. Within a few weeks, she was smuggling him little treats, extra food and snacks, trying to brighten up his bleak life behind bars. It was more than a nurse's compassion. It was personal affection. It didn't take long for the prison authorities to catch on. In August 2004, just months after she started, Jennifer was caught sneaking food to George. She was fired on the spot for this forbidden behavior, and George was promptly transferred to a different facility: Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. Normally, that would have been the end of a prohibited prison flirtation, but for George and Jennifer, it was only the beginning. Separated by hundreds of miles, the two kept their flame alive. They exchanged letters. Passionate, secret letters filled with longing and talk of a future together. Phone calls, if they were allowed, were rare and likely monitored, so written words became their lifeline. The more they wrote, the deeper their bond grew. By the fall of 2004, just weeks after losing her job, Jennifer was all in on this unlikely romance. She wanted to be with George, despite everything. At the end of November 2004, Jennifer and George made a bold move. They filed a request with the prison warden to get married. Ricky Bell, the warden at Riverbend, was stunned. He knew exactly who George was, a close custody inmate with violent offenses and a history of escapes, and he knew who Jennifer was, the ex-nurse who'd broken rules for this man. Warden Bell had serious misgivings and only grudgingly approved the marriage, knowing that the law favored inmate marriage rights. He imposed strict conditions. The ceremony would be non-contact, closely supervised, and absolutely no physical touch would be allowed. In the months leading up to the wedding, prison chaplains counseled the couple. They warned Jennifer about George's violent past, his drug issues, and the decades of his sentence remaining. She seemed to listen. She even delayed the wedding once, from April to May, but ultimately, love, or what she thought was love, prevailed. On May 21st, 2005, inside the prison walls, George and Jennifer became husband and wife. It was a brief and joyless ceremony, just the bride and groom on opposite sides of a glass partition, with a chaplain and a few guards watching. They couldn't so much as hold hands, let alone share a kiss. Still, when Jennifer said, "I do," she meant every word. She walked out of Riverbend that day as Mrs. Jennifer Hyatt, a prison wife. George was escorted back to his cell, now a married man in name, but no closer to real freedom. After the wedding, reality set in. They were married on paper, but they couldn't live together, sleep together, or even touch. Any hopes Jennifer had of a normal married life were dashed the moment the prison gates closed behind her that day. She was committed to George, but he was still locked away, slated to remain there until he was an old man. They could exchange letters, maybe talk on the phone occasionally, but that was it. For Jennifer, this wasn't enough. She was consumed by a single thought. She had to get George out. Exactly when the escape plan took shape isn't clear, but it likely began taking root shortly after their wedding. George certainly never stopped thinking about escaping. It was practically in his blood. And Jennifer, now deeply in love and dangerously devoted, was ready to do anything to be with her husband. By the summer of 2005, they had a plan. They realized that one of George's court appearances would be their best chance. Despite his long prison term, George still had an unresolved charge for an earlier armed robbery. A court date was set for August 9th, 2005 at the Roane County Courthouse. This was it. An opportunity for George to be outside the prison, in transit, where security might be easier to overcome. Through their clandestine communications, George got word to Jennifer about the time and place. They coordinated everything down to the details. Jennifer spent weeks preparing. At George's instruction, she acquired a handgun, a 9mm pistol, to use in the breakout, although she secretly hoped she would never have to use it. As you already know, her hopes were in vain. She also arranged transportation with careful foresight. Rather than rely on a single getaway car that police could quickly trace, she prepared two. She had her own dark-colored Ford Explorer, which she drove to the Kingston area. And she obtained a second vehicle, a gold Chevrolet minivan that she secretly stole for the occasion. With two vehicles at the ready, she could make a switch to throw off pursuers. She studied the area around the courthouse, noting where prisoners would likely come out and where she could position herself for a quick escape. When the fateful day arrived, Jennifer was ready. On the morning of August 9th, she waited in her gold minivan near the Rowan County Courthouse, nerves on edge, but determined. Around 10 a.m., George's hearing concluded. He pleaded guilty to the robbery charge inside, and 2 corrections officers escorted him out the side door toward the transport van. One guard was 56-year-old Wayne Cotton Morgan, a veteran officer nearing retirement. Beside him was another younger officer, armed and alert. George shuffled in his shackles between them, his heart no doubt pounding with anticipation. From her vantage point, Jennifer watched the trio emerge into daylight. This was her moment. She drove the van closer and then jumped out, gun in hand. For a split second, her hand trembled. The cold weight of the pistol felt alien, impossible. But then, George saw his wife and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Shoot him." Jennifer opened fire. The crack of the pistol echoed off the courthouse walls. Officer Morgan took a direct hit and collapsed, bleeding. His partner was struck in the arm but managed to draw his own gun and fire back, hitting Jennifer in the leg. Chaos erupted on the street as civilians screamed and ducked behind cars. Ignoring his chains, George yanked free of the stunned officers and, with hands still cuffed, bolted toward Jennifer's van. Jennifer, fighting through the pain of the gunshot wound, threw open the passenger door. George hauled himself inside the van, and Jennifer slammed her foot on the accelerator. Tires squealed and smoke billowed as she sped away from the courthouse, leaving Officer Morgan lying gravely wounded on the pavement. In the span of just a few seconds, they had done it. George was out of custody, and they were speeding toward what they hoped was freedom. The immediate aftermath was mayhem. Sirens blared across Kingston. Within minutes, local police, sheriff's deputies, and state troopers were swarming toward the courthouse. An ambulance rushed Officer Morgan to the nearest hospital, but tragically, he would not survive his wounds. His partner, despite his injury, gave a description of Jennifer, the van, and the direction that they fled. The manhunt for George and Jennifer Hyatt kicked off in full force. Tennessee authorities were furious and alarmed. A fellow officer was down and an armed fugitive couple was on the loose. Roadblocks sprang up on highways leading out of Rowan County. An all-points bulletin went out for a gold Chevy minivan with 2 occupants, and every law enforcement officer in the region was on high alert. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Jennifer and George executed the next phase of their plan. Realizing the van would be hot on police radar, they drove to a prearranged spot and abandoned it. The gold Chevy was left in a parking lot not far from the courthouse, quickly discovered by investigators. Inside, officers found a large smear of blood on the driver's seat, evidence that Jennifer had been wounded. But by the time it was found, the Hyatts were already gone in their second vehicle. They had jumped into the Ford Explorer and continued their flight, blending into normal traffic. For the rest of the day, the couple raced north. They stayed off the main highways as much as possible and kept the radio on, listening for news. As hours passed, authorities expanded the search across state lines, notifying Kentucky and Ohio police to be on the lookout. At some point during their escape, George and Jennifer realized they needed to change tactics again. Jennifer's leg was in agony and badly bleeding. She needed bandaging and rest, and the Ford Explorer, though not immediately known to police, could become a liability if they kept it too long. They decided to ditch it as well as try a less conspicuous way of traveling. Late that night, on August 9th, the Hyatts pulled into the parking lot of an Econo Lodge motel near Erlanger, Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati. There they left the Explorer behind. Perhaps they hoped it would throw off their trail or buy them a bit of time. Then they did something risky. They called for a taxi. In the early morning hours of August 10th, a Cincinnati area cab driver named Mike Wagers answered a fare in Erlanger. He picked up a couple carrying a few bags. The man was stocky, quiet. The woman had dyed black hair and walked with a limp. They offered him $200 cash to drive them all the way to Columbus, Ohio, about a 2-hour trip. During the ride, the pair was usually quiet. To break the silence, wagers asked about their destination, and the two casually mentioned that they were headed to an Amway business convention. That raised a red flag in the cabbie's mind. They didn't seem like business reps, and they didn't talk at all about their supposed convention. Something was off. The woman, Jennifer, winced in pain now and then, and when asked, she explained she'd been in a car accident recently. Mike noticed her story didn't quite add up, but he had no proof of anything. So, he just kept driving, watching them in his rearview mirror. Around midday on August 10th, the taxi rolled into Columbus, Ohio. As requested, Mike dropped the couple at a budget motel, the America's Best Value Inn, just off the highway. They thanked him, paid the fare in cash, and even gave a small tip. Then they disappeared into the motel. Mike drove off, still puzzled by his strange passengers. It wasn't until later, back in Kentucky, that he heard news reports about the fugitive Hyatts and the discovery of their abandoned vehicles near where he had picked up that quiet couple. It clicked in his mind. He had driven the escapees. Immediately, he contacted law enforcement and gave them the information about where he had taken them. That tip was exactly what the authorities needed. U.S. Marshals and local police in Columbus had already been alerted that the Hyatts might be headed their way, and now they had a specific location. At that moment, what George and Jennifer had so long dreamed of finally happened. They were alone. They could at last touch each other, kiss, and rejoice in their being together for a few fleeting minutes in a cheap motel room in Ohio. They weren't a fugitive and an accomplice. They were just husband and wife. The prison walls, the police sirens, the entire world seemed to melt away. It seemed to them that it was all over. However, they didn't know that the taxi driver had recognized them and alerted the authorities, and that their idyll would soon come to an end. On the night of August 10th, a swarm of law enforcement officers surrounded the America's Best Value Inn. They zeroed in on the second-floor room where a clerk had earlier checked in a limping woman and a man paying cash. Around 10 p.m., with at least 24 officers in position outside, the phone in the Hyatt's motel room rang. Jennifer picked up the phone, her heart no doubt pounding. A deputy marshal identified herself and calmly told Jennifer that the building was surrounded. There was no escape. They needed to come out with their hands up. For a moment, silence. Then Jennifer's voice, trembling, called out to George inside the room. "Baby, it'll be okay. It'll be okay." Outside, officers could hear her pleading with him not to resist. The thought of losing George now in a suicidal shootout was unbearable to her. She surrendered emotionally in that instant. The door opened slowly. First came Jennifer, limping and holding her hands high. She was immediately pulled aside by officers and placed in handcuffs. "Please don't hurt him," she begged, craning her neck to look back for George. A moment later, George stepped out. He had pulled his t-shirt up over his face to show he wasn't armed and kept his hands visible. Under the watch of drawn rifles, he turned around and dropped to his knees. Officers rushed in and took him down, cuffing his hands behind his back. And just like that, the Hyatt's brief run was over. They were captured without a single shot fired. After a frantic 36 hours of freedom, George Hyatte was going back to prison and Jennifer Hyatte was joining him as an inmate. News of their capture spread quickly, and a collective sigh of relief went out among law enforcement. The nightmare was over, and a pair of criminals, one seasoned, one newly minted by love, were off the streets. In the months and years that followed, George and Jennifer faced the consequences of their actions. Both were charged with first-degree murder for the death of Officer Morgan, among other charges like attempted murder, assault, and escape. Tennessee prosecutors initially signaled that they might seek the death penalty, given the killings of the law enforcer. But Jennifer, racked with guilt and without hope of a normal life, agreed in 2007 to a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to the murder and received a life sentence, with no possibility of parole. As part of her deal, she spared herself a potential death sentence and agreed to testify against her husband if needed. In the end, her testimony wasn't required. In 2009, George also pleaded guilty rather than go to trial. He, too, received life in prison without parole, avoiding the death penalty but ensuring he will never see freedom again. George, the inmate who was obsessed with escaping, finally landed in a place from which there was no escape. A maximum security cell for the rest of his life. They are now separated in different prisons. No more wedding vows or love letters. Their only communication might be an occasional exchange through lawyers or a brief, supervised visit. If that. If you enjoyed this Prison Break case, check out the channel. There you'll find many great stories just like this one. If you like what you see, please subscribe. I'd be very grateful, and I'll catch you next time.